Hi, everyone. Hi, Ashley. Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us on this Wednesday. Y'all, I'm feeling the first steps. I know we're talking about first steps, and this is not technically the first time we're doing a live, but it has been a minute since Ashmi and I have been here on with you all. So thank you again for stopping by. And as usual, we're going to just, hang out for a few minutes to let folks transition from their other meetings to join us in this space. But if you're already here with us, feel free to just like connect with us through the comments as well. We usually love hearing from you all in the comment section. And one question that we wanted to ask you all today is what comes up for you when you hear the phrase first steps? What is that feeling that comes up? Is there a thought that comes up? To give you an example, one of the things I always feel like when someone says, hey, you got to do first step, it's like this, what? I got to do what? So we'll definitely explore that today in terms of why it can be challenging for us. And this is also a two-part series, so we'll get to explore this twice together because when Ashmi and I were talking through this topic that we wanted to share with you all, we thought that there was going to be three really common reasons. And then as we continued to think about it more, there became three even deeper, more nuanced reasons. So we wanted to split it out into two categories to share with you all. But before we dive in, what we usually do when we start off at the top is just to share a few agreements. One thing that we want to encourage everyone is just to stay curious when you're on these talks, right? What Ashmi and I always say all the time is there's no right or wrong perspective. You are hearing two life coaches here. I'm sure if you ask another life coach, they might have a slightly different take as well. But we just want to give you all a place to start when it comes to looking at first steps together. And the other thing is to stay open. A lot of the topics that we talk about here are bigger, broader patterns, meaning you're not going to hear any silver bullet solutions here. You're not going to try something we mentioned one time and hallelujah, we never have trouble with first steps again. That is not something we're gonna promise you because we can't. But just to help you think about the mindsets and some practices to take on that would just be a little easier for you the next time you have to start a first step or to restart a first step, which we'll get into in a second. So for those of you who are new to me, hi, my name is Betty Chan. I am an authenticity life coach, facilitator, and a speaker. And I primarily support folks who I call code switchers. So you could be first gen, you could be someone who just is straddling multiple cultures, or even someone trying to figure out how do I get my personal self, the fun me over here, with my work self over here, which doesn't seem to embody that, or vice versa. So how do we bring all those parts of who we are and just feel like we have permission to show up exactly as we are in whatever room we're in with whoever we're talking to? So that's the type of work I do as a life coach, focusing on authenticity. And also with me is Ashmi today.
Hello. Yeah, as Betty said, this isn't a first, but it feels like a first again. And so, literally, as she was introducing herself, I find myself bracing as, when you're a kid and you know that you have to read next in class. So you jump ahead to the page and practice. So anyways, hi, everyone. As you can tell, we like to keep it really casual and share our real candid experiences because everyone is just trying to find their way on this path and journey. But yeah, a little bit about myself. I'm a life coach for children of immigrants and late diagnosed ADHDers. And I really like to help people let go of perfectionism, shame, and people-pleasing tendencies so that they can build a life that they actually want and that's built around their intuition rather than what other people have told them or external expectations. And my approach is rooted in radical self-acceptance. And so I like to use that to help clients trust themselves and find some ease on their path. And a lot of people, I think, confuse radical self-acceptance with apathy of just oh, I'm just going to accept everything the way I am and never change again. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think once you're able to radically accept the way you are, it's easy to accept that oh, this is just the way I am right now. And it doesn't mean that I don't want to change or become a better person. It's just that like I don't have to shame myself for what's showing up, and I like through that acceptance I can find a more kinder and gentle way to get to the place I want to be and become the person that I want to be. And just like not be so harsh on yourself in your head. I like to say that life is hard. I'm not in the business of making it any harder.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And like for folks who are on the tough love end of the spectrum, I say I'm about soft accountability and slow journeys. So yeah, so if you just like want someone to help you learn how to be gentle with yourself and to also be gentle with you, I'm the coach for you.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like we both introduced ourselves, and we would also love to know who's on the call today. So if you want to drop in the chat your name and where you're coming from, as well as we're curious what comes to mind, like when you hear first step, what's the first thing that pops into your head, and like if you would like to share that with us, we just want to hear. I think as Betty said, when we were talking about this, a lot of stuff came up for us. And so we want to know what you're bringing to the table today and what you want to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And today's topics are especially, I wouldn't say exciting, but interesting because as we were coming up with them, we realized that what we're talking about today is so common that a lot of people forget to even consider it, or it's just like so ingrained in us that it's not always a consideration for why something is hard for us. And
Mm-hmm.
we really love talking about things like that because sometimes things that you're like so embarrassed to say out loud or you wouldn't even know to consider can be the thing that's holding you back the most. And that kind of leads me into the first one, which is like we don't know what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And Betty, feel free to interject anytime you want. But I think for me, a lot of times I realize that I can get really stuck on like, why can't I get started on something?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes it is as simple as like, I just don't have all the information that I need to start.
Yes. And like shaming ourselves, and we might not even realize it, but how do I put it? There's just like two thoughts of like, oh, I know I need to start this thing, but I don't know what to do, but I don't want to admit that I don't know what to do because I feel like I should know what to do at this point. Whenever those two thoughts pop up for me, that's when I know I'm in that moment of like, oh, I don't know what I don't know, but I'm not giving myself the permission to do that because there's some part of me that believes that I should, even though I've never freaking done this before, right? It's just, I think that tends to get more and more noticeable in our mindset as we get older. And the example that comes to mind is something that Ashmi and I talked about a lot, even just outside of coaching. Like we're both learning to swim right now in our personal lives. And that's something that I've been saying for years I wanted to start. And even when I knew what the steps are, like go sign up for a gym, find a local pool, find someone to teach me, even with those basic steps out of the way, there were more first steps waiting for me that I didn't know existed. So when I went to the pool, it can sound so silly to even admit out loud, but like, yeah, where do I put my bag? I don't want things to get wet. Like what do I put in my bag to begin with before I leave? Do I do flip-flops? Do I do shampoo? Do I bring a towel, etc.? So just really allowing yourself the space to assess what you're going to need. And if you truly feel like you can't, like, oh, there's something there, I can't quite see it, to ask for support on that as well. Because sometimes you might know more than you realize and you're blocking yourself on that. But other times it's true. Like we're not experts in the thing we're about to do yet. So why would we know all the steps that it takes to get there? Yeah.
Yeah. And it also makes me think of like, I think we often categorize what types of things should be hard for us.
Mm.
So it's like, oh, I can recognize that I'm a beginner at swimming or going to the pool. But because I'm a full grown woman, it shouldn't be so hard for me to like join a new rec center and get myself to the pool, right? Like that was a narrative I was telling myself of like, oh, as an adult who can handle a lot of things,
Hmm.
something as simple as going to the pool shouldn't be so hard. And so I think a lot of us can do this categorization of just what should be hard or what shouldn't, regardless of if it's our first time doing it. And it's just like, as a kid, you feel like it's okay to be a beginner because people are constantly teaching you how to do things. And as an adult, you're supposed to be the person who just like knows everything.
Yeah.
I think it's good to like catch yourself and challenge yourself into like, what are my expectations of myself? Like, why do I think that I should just all of a sudden know all things that are to be known?
Yeah. Yeah. Like, where am I expecting myself to be an expert when this has literally never been an experience in my life? And being comfortable leaning on other things for it. If you need to Google a bit more before you actually take that first step, that's fine. If you know someone in your life who's done it before, like for me, I don't have anyone in my life who knows how to swim, using that example. And I know I could, swimming's one of those things also. I can Google videos all day, but I'm never actually going to learn to swim by watching other people do it on YouTube. So actually allowing myself to look for a teacher, to ask for that help, for someone to see the things I know I won't see, to point out what those first steps could be for me. And I think by doing that, it allowed me to break a little more, not break, but like create a little more space for self-compassion to happen also, that like this is new, this is going to be overwhelming, I am going to resist a lot more than I usually would. And all of that is not just okay, is to be expected when I'm starting something new and taking that first step.
Yeah. And I also think of like breaking the barrier of being seen as a beginner.
Mm,
So, like, I think a lot of us don't want other people to witness us trying or witness us like fumbling in the beginner stage.
mhm.
But I do think that there's an element of just knowing that there's no way around that.
Yeah.
Or the only
I
way
mean,
around it is to like hide from doing things.
mhm. Where do you think we get that from, Ashmi?
Well, what a good question. Um, I mean, I think we get it from a lot of different places. I think this idea of not wanting to be seen as a beginner or as somebody who's trying comes from this like perfectionism, also like some people pleasing and just like caring what other people think about you.
Mm,
And I think that, I mean, I also think there's a little bit of ego in there, right? Like, we don't
mm.
want somebody to judge us or to see us as like not being good at something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I'm curious how it manifests for you, but like for me, it just manifests as like an inner dialogue. And I've learned to just be better at knowing that that's going to show up, but like
Mhm.
weighing out my options of like, oh, do I want to listen to my inner dialogue and not get in the pool at all? Or do I want to get in the pool and just like let my inner dialogue kind of be there and be like, okay, fine. Like, yeah, we are moving really slowly in the water today.
Yeah.
And people are seeing that, but like, okay, cool. Like, it is true. I am moving slowly in the water. And if they're seeing that, then they're seeing that.
Mhm.
So I think for me, like, it comes back to the radical self acceptance of like, if I know I'm slow, then there's nothing more to do about it than just to like know that I'm slow and that other people might recognize it too.
Yeah. And I know we use the language of slow in a very like accepting way. And I think when I first started hearing that, it did bring up a little bit of resistance in me as well, especially as someone who worked in the agency realm for 9 to 5, and like you need to maximize productivity every minute of your day as much as possible. So the goal there was actually to go as fast as possible for as long as possible, which since then, going through multiple burnouts, I've learned that like actually slowing down is the better strategy for me in the long run to do the things that I want to do, because my goals actually take months and years to actually realize. Um, but yeah, it's that slowness. It's because it manifests for me there, the thought still comes up once in a while, like, oh, I'm not picking this up as fast as X person. And it's funny
Mhm.
because when we're talking about the pool, I remember thinking of this when I had to go on a company ski trip as well, going down the bunny slope. And I'm like, the 5-year-olds are so much better than me at this. Like, what is going on? And feeling that judgment really come up for myself of, oh, I can't even be faster than a 5-year-old, which now that I've taken time to slow down and process that judgment, I was like, actually, of course, a 5-year-old is going to be way faster than me in doing anything physical because they don't have that fear of body injury the way I do as an adult. But because I say that because also in my pool, there's a lot of older folks who
Me
are
too.
swimming, and they actually are a really big source of inspiration for me. So even though they move slowly, it's in this almost like unapologetic way of like, I'm just gonna swim at the pace I'm trying to swim. I'm not trying to be an Olympic athlete at this point. And like it's fine. Like we're here. That's the point. Like participation points, like is the thing to go for here.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, on the flip side, I have some older people that are at the pool with me that, in my opinion, are like Olympic level. And I'm like, oh my God, like you're going so fast. Um, but again, yeah, like seeing it as an inspiration instead of a comparison point
Yes. Hmm.
of like they looked like me at some point in their swimming journey or whatever you're a beginner at. Um,
Hmm.
yeah. And I think coming back to the like, we don't know what we don't know. I think also it's helpful to know that you might just be stuck because you don't have enough information,
Hmm.
and that like breaking that barrier to asking for help or asking a question can be really helpful to get unstuck from taking
Hmm.
the first step.
Yeah. And I think if I can suggest it as a practice for folks, it's whenever you do sense that stuckness, either you're given a new project and you're supposed to be the leader of it. If you're like us, you're just starting a new physical activity and you're like, what is that? Just allow yourselves. I think the question to ask yourself is like, what questions can be answered that will help me feel more at ease with doing this? And just allowing yourself the permission to take stock of what those questions are. And then from there, you can decide who gets to help you to answer that as well. And based on what we shared, the other thing I wanted to suggest to folks is where am I expecting myself to be the expert?
Mm,
Right? Just taking note of that. You can even jot down like a quick brain dump list of like, where am I expecting myself to be an expert right now? And is that a fair expectation to have on myself?
yeah. Yeah. I feel like you're in my head because that's like the perfect transition into the next point that I was like thinking of right as you said it, of this idea. Like, I feel like we can obsess over all of the little steps as well as the ideal outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, like the question of
Mm.
where do I think I'm an expert? And I think a lot of times, if we have reached a level of expertise at in some point of our life, right? So like if you're a senior leader at work, or like even if you're a parent, like you have reached a certain level of expertise or in adulthood if you're taking care of a
Mm.
human being, um, you all of a sudden then expect yourself to never be able to be a beginner at anything because
Mm.
seen as an expert at some point in your life, that identity almost like masks your ability to be
Mhm.
fresh or a beginner at anything.
Mhm.
And I think that that can be this this seems very obvious, but I'm going to say it. I think that that can be very limiting because, and also just like unfair to you as
Mhm.
you try new things, and like should be allowed to be curious and need help and go at your own pace. Um,
Mhm.
like my favorite analogy is if you woke up one day and we're going to run a marathon, you would not go run 26 miles that day. Like you
No.
just couldn't. And I think that a lot of us have that expectation with so many other
Yeah.
things in life.
Mhm.
And if you have that kind of expectation in your head, it makes total sense that you can't take the first step.
Mhm. Mhm. If I can add on that, like that That's almost like stage 2 of what happens after what we talked about, like, you don't know what you don't know. And then say I get the information and I'm like, "Okay, I know it requires these 52 steps to do the things I need to do." I made up a number, people. I hope there are not 52 steps to do whatever you need to do. But then I get obsessive about like what is the best order? What is the most efficient use of my time? And each step feels like a non-negotiable. Like I have to do all 52 steps in order to get to the expertise or the outcome or the project goal that I want. And I find myself in that a lot. And I do think it comes from perfectionism. It comes from anyone who has a background where like you're asked to perform at a high level all the time. And then that becomes a very automatic expectation of yourself. Like now that I know what the steps are, I'm going to have to do all of them perfectly before I can get to the goal and the destination that I want to. But the 52 steps is just one plan. It's one version, it's one pathway to where you need to go. You can actually possibly get to a version of your goal with just taking 5 steps or whatever variation. And the thing I'm encouraging folks here is when we start to feel like the steps are heavy, like, oh my, the dread comes up, like, oh my God, I can't believe I need to do all this. Maybe start to ask yourself, like, what are actual required steps? And like, can I pick and choose the things that feel really good for, again, this is your first time doing it. You don't need to be at the level of someone who's been doing it for 10 years. You don't need to be at Olympic level at that point. But like, what is a meaningful first version of an outcome? And what are the steps? What are the 2, 3 steps you need to get there and start there? Because once we get to that point of our journey, we get new information, things become a little easier, more muscle memory, and then you actually have a better capacity to take on a few more steps from there as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so that reminds me of a tactic that ADHD, like people with ADHD use, which is just like we know that we don't have enough dopamine to get things started, which
Mhm.
is what makes like a lack of executive function really hard. And so the thing is like start with something small that is going to give you the dopamine to then be able to like scaffold on that and do more things. And
Mm.
I feel like that's like really similar to what you just said of you start out of order or whatever with what feels good and right, and then you will have more capacity to do more.
Mhm.
And yeah, and I think like this concept of seeing all the steps at one and then getting attached to the outcome before you've done anything like makes
Yeah.
it really impossible. It's almost like a cycle of self-sabotage a little bit
Mm.
because you get attached to this idea of like perfection or the ideal outcome. And
Mhm.
then in your head, you're like spiraling and you almost decide that like, oh, that's like so impossible to do that I might as well not start.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think it happens so quickly that it's really hard to catch yourself. And then all it feels like in the end is that I'm stuck and I can't get started.
Yes. I was gonna say the phrase that you and I use for each other all the time is, "Hey, are we doing that all or nothing thing again?" And it is really hard to spot on your own. So like, don't feel any sort of way about not being able to spot that for yourselves. It helps to have people around you be like, hey, it does feel like you're getting a bit attached to the end result and what it should look like. And is there a more relaxed way of doing it? Because nobody wants to travel that road where you're just white knuckling the whole way there. It's not fun.
Yeah. And it gives you like no space and time to learn from
Hmm.
the beginning steps. So
Hmm.
it's like if you planned out your whole year and then expected yourself to do every step
Yeah.
exactly, then
Yeah.
you just wouldn't grow as a person or learn anything along the way, and there would be
Hmm.
no adapting or evolving.
Yeah.
And I think that when we're wanting to take the first step, we think of beginning and middle.
Yeah. Like there's
And
a certain order to it.
yeah, and really it's just about that first step.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even matter if it comes from the beginning, end, or middle.
Mhm. Yeah, that's why I appreciate you mentioning the ADHD strategy of like just take a step. right? Your first step is just going to be the first step you take, right? It's not only this step over here qualifies to be first step. Any step that you end up taking becomes your first step. So go out of order if you need to. Um, and realize that like by taking that first step, you're energizing yourself too. You're actually giving yourself more energy to then end up at the next one. I know I usually do.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say, just to bring a little of the personal, I felt it even when we were planning this live. So, like, for folks who listen to us, we really like to put our stuff on display sometimes. It's been a minute. Like, you guys haven't seen us on LinkedIn Live. We had some traveling and some family stuff in the middle of the year and decided that, it would be in service of how we want to live our life and to be present of the things around us to not add that on. But what that means is that we haven't done this in a few months. And even at the start of today, I was like, oh my God, where's the record button again? And like, oh wait, I forgot to put the photo. Like all the things that I should know that I've done on autopilot at the early part of this year just came roaring back as first steps. Right. And I can imagine an older version of myself, even the version of me last year, being like, I can't believe you fell off this bandwagon, Betty. You have to like, you're creating so much work for yourself now to have to relearn everything. That is a very real voice that lives in my head. But recognizing and like the self-compassion we're trying to encourage folks is like recognizing like, oh, even if I've done something before, it could become a first again if I haven't done it in a long time. Right? Because my brain is really good at like, I'm going to get efficient about the things you do regularly all the time. But if we don't need this skill set, we don't need this tool right now, I'm going to put it back to the back room and then we can go get that tool later on when we need it, which I needed it today. So just allowing yourself the grace to be like, oh, I have done this before. I do know what the steps are. So I'm not doing the first part where we mentioned like, I don't know what I don't know. I do know what the steps are, but just not obsessing over the efficiency or the perfect order that you need to do things in, and the outcome of what it needs to look like for us as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's this expectation that like once you've done something a certain way, that like then you have learned this thing and you should always do it that way forever. So
Mm-hmm.
it all like again, we're setting ourselves up to not be human because it's like, oh, I was able to I feel like I do this all the time. Like I'm chronically late. I have time blindness, yes, all the things. But like if I can get to a place in 10 minutes, then my brain forever will think that I can get there in 10 minutes,
Yes.
right?
Oh, mine does that too.
Like all the red lights and the potential traffic and the school zone of
Mm-hmm.
timing and whatever. I'm just like, well, once in my life I got there in 10 minutes. Therefore,
Mm-hmm.
every
All the
time I
time.
go from point A to point B, I should get there in 10 minutes. And we so do this in our lives, right? We're like, I was able to finish like that task in 30 minutes. So
Mm-hmm.
now every single time I do it, it'll take me 30 minutes. But we don't think of like the red lights or the school zones of our life, which is like, I could be lower energy, or I could be
Mm-hmm.
burnt out from like a really hard week, or
Mm-hmm.
just like oftentimes the task does look different. And so it is going to have a different outcome or feel different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's a good challenge to allow yourself to like be present enough to see it for what it is than for what you want it to be,
Mm-hmm.
and allow yourself to show up to the task as you are instead of as you want yourself to show up to the task.
Yeah. Yeah. And it all comes in how we talk back to ourselves. Not all of it, but it's a really important part of practice of like just what are we saying, what are we not saying. So we've given everyone a few examples today, but I'm always someone who's looking for kinder ways to talk to myself, especially because it's not something that I was taught to do and had to like really figure that out for myself as an adult. So at this point, I want to welcome, like, if there's a phrase that you say to yourself that like brings out
Mhm.
that self-compassion and that radical self-love, like share it with us because you don't know who you might be inspiring in the comments for someone else who might need to hear that today. So just want to open that invitation up for folks before we go into the third, possibly obvious, but possibly so obvious we no longer see it version, which is I mean, we kind of touched on it a little bit already, like hidden time pressures, but we want to name it as that of the example you gave Ashmi, where it's like we've done it once this way and it took us 10 minutes or it took us an hour. And like I'm never allowed to take more time ever again after that. But what are some other like hidden time pressures that might come up and make our first steps a lot harder than it needs to be?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think back to like what can be hard for ADHDers is like because of the time blindness, we don't always like it's difficult for us to know how long a certain task is going to take. And so
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that like legitimate blindness of being able to like fit it into your schedule or just know
Mm-hmm.
can lead to paralysis. And so then it like of course makes sense that you can't take the first step because you don't even know like how much time to allot for yourself to do
Mm,
it. So it's almost the opposite of what we said of like, oh, if I did it fast once, I should expect that. Sometimes it's like you expect it to be fast and then it ends up slower. So then you get frustrated. And like that cycle can build up in your head and
mm.
keep you from doing anything because you're just like, well, I don't even know if I'm going to have enough time.
Yes. Yeah, I can
And
see
so
that.
then you're like, and it's not a conscious choice of like, so then I'm just going to sit here. It's really then you're going to sit there and ruminate back and forth on if you should do it or
Mhm. Mhm. Either
not.
rumination or like avoidance. I'm like, I'm gonna do everything else instead of this thing I said I wanted to start, and I'm not gonna take that first step because everything else I have somehow in my brain think I know how long that's gonna take, but because this is new, I don't have that like spaciousness to start that now. Does it feel like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example of, like, how you can find yourself doing a bunch of other things before you started the thing that you
Guilty.
wanted to do. But I also think it's, a little bit of just, like, the buildup of, like, paralysis and anxiety and shame all into one,
Mm, mhm,
and it's not like you're sitting down and pulling that apart for yourself, so then you really are just sitting there unable to get started on anything. And it's a really difficult thing to explain to people because externally you look fine. Externally, people are just like, why can't you do the thing? And so a lot of ADHDers will get labeled as lazy. And it's like, we don't even know how to communicate to you that, like, I can't do the thing. But if you
mm,
ask me right now what needs to be done, I will give you a whole list of like exactly how it should be
mm,
done. But I just like can't get myself to start it. And it's a lot of time it's like the shame, anxiety, paralysis of knowing like you know what needs to be done, but you get caught up in like the order or how long it's gonna take or whatever.
mhm,
And
mhm,
um so one, I think I just wanted to name that because it is something that ADHDers really struggle with, and it goes so unseen because it is hard to explain to somebody who has a neurotypical brain.
mhm.
Um, but at the same time, like I think a a way to like try and get yourself out of it is to just like grab a timer and say, I'm just gonna do something for 5 minutes.
Mhm.
And it can just be anything you can think of that's related to that task. And that oftentimes can get you started.
Yes. Yeah.
Of
It's like
just, like,
just
taking the
take
pressure
like what is the next closest thing that I feel confident and I know I can do, and just take that again. Whatever step you end up taking does become the first step. It's not about order, it's not about perfectionism, but taking it is important. And you can break that down. I think a lot of times when I work with my clients, the thing I notice is that even when they break down a step, it's still a really massive step. Like
Mhm,
I visually imagine it as like I'm a 5'2" person and I'm trying to climb a step that like requires my legs to be above my head. Like that can feel really overwhelming and straining. So like keep breaking it down. If that broken down first step still feels too big, break it down even more. So something that I know I struggle with sometimes as undiagnosed ADHD is which I talk to you about a lot, Ashmi. It's like, I gotta go brush my teeth. It's part of my well being. I know I feel better. I'm an adult. I should know to brush my teeth. But sometimes it's just so hard to get up to do it, especially with the winter coming and everything's getting dark and cold. Like, I don't want to move. And I would just look at my feet and I'm like, all I got to do is to get my feet to touch the floor. And then once
Mhm.
that foot's on the floor, can I get up and stand? And then can I put another foot in front of that other foot? So it can feel silly of like, wow, you got to like really break it down. But that's what it takes to go from one place, from point A to point B. We just often dismiss all those micro steps that need to happen for us to get to the destination we want to. So you reminded me of that.
Yeah, and I think we often very much discount the speed at which our brain is firing at that. So, like, you might not be able to, like, get out of bed to brush your teeth, and so you have to, like, really scale it down to, like, just get my feet on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
but your brain is doing a whole other thing. Like, your brain is probably like, "I have to brush my teeth and shower and get breakfast and get my day started and da da da." And
Yeah,
that's what's, like,
the
truly
cascading.
and that's what's actually causing the paralysis, and so I think
Mm,
what people think externally looks like laziness is actually just all of that, like, hyperactivity happening in your head,
yes.
and I just really like to point that out because I think a lot of people are like, "You just want me to what? Think about putting my feet on the ground?" And it's like,
Mhm.
yes, but only because we're very well aware of what's happening in your head,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
sometimes you just have to pull it apart for yourself because you are gonna get to all those things, like,
Mhm.
the clients we work with are gonna get to everything because
Mhm.
they're just very capable and driven, but I I think I just, like, always wanna say that there's no shame in scaling it back for yourself. I think people
Yeah.
hold a lot of shame in creating smaller like, what we think are easy, like, baby steps, but it's honestly, like, I don't wanna say the only way because I hate that phrase, but it is a great way to give
Yeah.
yourself a more gentle, runway and a more gentle landing pad to do the thing you're gonna do anyways.
Mhm.
It's just maybe do it with a little less shame and and you might get started earlier. Like, you just might spend less time in paralysis.
Mhm. And there's not to say that if you start slow, you won't go faster later, right?
Yes.
I think there's also a little expectation of like, damn, if I don't start fast, then like this is the tone, this is the speed limit. I have to drive forever and it's going to take me forever to get to my goal. That's not going to be the case. Like, you will have moments where you're moving fast, you will have moments where you're moving a little slower. And actually expecting that fluctuation to happen along the way in your journey, it's going to be a much kinder way to keep taking the first step and the ongoing additional first steps that you will inevitably run across when you're doing something new
Yeah.
or old but now new. They both apply. Yes. I mean, one example is coming to mind because it's the time of the year, right? Like, this is something I struggle with year after year. And I'm like, man, I've been an adult for 3+ decades. And I'm like, I should know and expect this around this time of the year. But I forget it every single time because November happens once a year. November doesn't happen month after month every year. And I'm talking about the holidays, right? With the upcoming holidays and travel, I think a lot of us, especially with September back to school or starting Q4, if you're in the business world, you want to hit the ground running. You expect, like, oh, I got only just a few more months left a year. Let me get to all my goals. This is my last shot, my last chance to do it. And that's another hidden time pressure we have on ourselves as well. And when we do that, let's say you even do that, you get gung ho, you know your steps, you put aside the perfectionism, like, I'm just going to take that first step. I'm going to spend 30 minutes. I'm going to keep going. But then we then create a certain pace for ourselves. Like, oh, on a
Mhm.
given week, I can get 10 tasks done and I can really move my projects forward this way. Forgetting that once we get to the holidays, there are different things on that task list that we don't count, that we forget to see. So those 10 things you need to do is on top of the 10 things you also need to do as a host, as getting with your family, of getting gifts, of checking in with people. All of that needs to happen as well, but we don't have that on our obvious to-do lists. And we just start to judge ourselves like, why can't I move as fast? Why am I not getting to the same productivity as I did before with these 10 steps that I've done before? Um, all I'm saying is like around the holidays, especially just recognizing that those steps that you have that you've perfected and you've gotten good at will have to look different because they're no longer just 10 steps. They are 10 steps on top of everything else you need to do around the holiday season as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that also makes me think of it's like flipping the whole question on its head of like, so today we're talking about why is it so hard to take the first step? But sometimes I'm just curious, like for myself and my clients, of like, what are we even counting as like the first step that we can't take?
Mm.
Because it almost feels very black and white of like two lists of like steps I've taken, steps I can't. And we focus so much on like the things we haven't started or like that project that I said I would do for so many years and I just like never got to it or whatever.
Mm.
But when we like lean into that narrative, it's like always in the absence of all the other stuff that we did do,
Yeah.
right? So I'm just like, oh, like this project, like, oh, I've like wanted to do this art project since last year this time.
Mm.
And it would be so easy, and I sometimes do like fall into the shame of like, oh, like I bought all the stuff and I watched all the tutorials and I was like so ready and I just never started it.
So you got step 1 and 2 checked off.
Yeah, right. So I got step 1 and step 2 check it. Thank you for thank you for catching me in that. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, on the other end of like running a business for the first time, like all this other stuff. But instead, it's just like so easy to be like, oh, I'm someone who doesn't start things that I want to start.
Mhm.
And so I do think that it's important to look at the bigger picture. Like you said, like in the holidays, there's like so many things you're not counting. And I just think in general, we tell ourselves these stories that are based off of one very myopic example.
Mm.
And if you step back and look at the bigger picture, fine, there's probably a lot of things you haven't started. But like, what about all the other things you did start? Or what about
Yeah.
all the other things that you completed or that are still in motion? And I just think that we can't look at like in the same way you don't want your doctor to like treat you only by whatever body part is hurting.
Yeah.
Like you can't treat yourself the same way either because you're a whole person with a whole life
Yes.
and lots of other inputs are coming in. And so
Mhm.
you not starting the thing probably has a lot more to do with everything else except that one thing.
Yeah. And that is something we see time and again with our clients. Like we treat our projects, we treat our goals as if they're in this protected lane, not realizing that everything else we need to do, like pending to experience as human beings, is going to inevitably have an impact on that project as well. So, growing our awareness of like, all right, if it's hard, it's not just about the stuff in this project plan that's right in front of me, but it might be hard because there's all these other things around it leaving an imprint on it also and helping us grow that awareness of, yeah, where is our energy going? Where is our hesitation actually coming from? And what are the steps that feel a lot kinder and gentler as a first step? Because first steps are hard to begin with already, but they don't need to be any harder.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're almost coming to time for our part one. We're actually really excited for part two because if you can't tell by now, Ashmi and I love the nuance stuff. We love when things get really overlapped and complicated and tangly. So the next 3 points we share in part two will feel a little less obvious that, but we see often as coaches as well, and we wanted to share with everyone. Again, in service of growing our collective awareness of like what else is taking our energy, what else is taking our confidence away when we can be very confident, very comfortable what we need to do to keep moving forward. But just maybe as a recap, what's one thing, Ashmi, if someone comes to you and like, I need to start this thing and I can't, what is one thing you would recommend for them to try?
Ooh, one thing. I mean, I think for me, and I joke with my clients that I feel like they like love and hate when I say this phrase of like are you ready to, or like, are you up to dig deeper?
Mm.
And I would just say, like, essentially, like breaking down the unknown. So, what is it that you're not seeing that is making it hard for you to start? And it can be like
Mhm.
any of the things that we said today, or it can just be that you're not allowing yourself to be a beginner. But
Mhm.
it's always about more than just like I can't get started. And I would challenge somebody just to sit with that, to say, okay, like what could it be? I'm not saying like you sit down and expect yourself to figure it out, but if you just ask yourself, like, what else is going on in my life?
Mhm.
Then you might come up with some answers that make sense. Like, as simple as, like, I haven't slept in a week, or
Yeah.
things are really crazy at work right now. And so, of course, I can't like get started on cleaning the garage today.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I would say to dig deep and just like break down the unknown that is behind the thing that you can't get started.
Yeah. And that goes back to one of our agreements, just staying curious, right? Like stay curious of like what else could be contributing to that as well. I think that's a good suggestion. Um, I'll just repeat the ones we mentioned a little earlier. I think sometimes we don't realize the expectations we have for ourselves until we ask it in a very point blank question. And one thing to ask yourself in this season, if you feel like it's hard to take a first step, is like, where are you expecting yourself to be an expert? And also, where are you expecting, or sorry, the second one would be to ask, what is that one question that's really holding me back? Like, I don't know blank. Fill that
Yeah.
in and allow yourself to look at that and be aware of that without judgment and just be like, who in my life can help me actually answer this with a lot more ease?
Yeah. Like when I
Mhm.
asked Betty where I would put my flip flops at the pool.
Which I had a lot of tips for.
Felt like such an embarrassing question, but it was really keeping me from going. So, yeah.
Mm. All right. Well, we'll be wrapping up part one. Stay tuned, everyone, for part two. We'll be coming in roughly about 2 weeks. So we're excited to share the more tricky things to look out for when it comes to the hesitation we feel around taking our first step. But other than that, if you want to connect with us between now and then, you can find me at heybettychan.com. That's my website, or you can continue to follow me on YouTube or LinkedIn and Instagram as well. We'll leave all those links in a comment because it would take forever to have to spell all of that out. So definitely reach out if you just want to elaborate on something we talked about today, or to, yeah, just ask a new question if it comes to mind. How about you, Ashmi? What's the best way for folks to reach you?
Um, my website, ashmipatel.com, is probably the easiest way because that'll have all the links to my LinkedIn, my Instagram, my YouTube, all the things.
That's true.
If you want to schedule a call and talk to me, the website has all of that. But yeah, I would say Instagram and LinkedIn are the most fun places to follow me. So if you want like the fun things and all the tips with some fun content, then I would follow me on both of those. But yeah, we'll put all the links, and thank you so much for coming. And we really hope to hear from you either in our DMs or the comment section.
Yeah. Happy first steps, everyone. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.